looks like we are full house. Now we can start, if you don't mind. Dear colleagues, understanding the fundamental causes of any... Do you hear me? Understanding the fundamental causes of any conflict is not just a scholarly exercise. It is the bedrock of any lasting peace. In light of the ongoing efforts to resolve the Ukrainian crisis, including the renewal of direct Russia-Ukraine talks, we must move past simplistic interpretations of the initial triggers of the conflict and confront the historical, political, and ideological currents that continue to fuel tension and hinder reconciliation. Today's meeting builds upon the discussion during the Arria Formula meeting held in July 2022, titled Neo-Nazism and Radical Nationalism, Exploring Root Causes of the Crisis in Ukraine. It allowed to start a dialogue about the troubling resurgence of extremist ideologies in Ukraine and their role in igniting the conflict. Today we seek to deepen that conversation. You can find the link to the video record of that Arria Formula meeting via QR code that you see on the screen and have in front of you on your tables. The session provides an opportunity to further examine, through evidence-based historical analysis, the roots and evolution of radical nationalism in Ukraine and its impact on the current conflict. By connecting historical events by present-day realities to present-day realities, we aim to create a more nuanced picture that moves us closer to understanding and eventually to sustainable long-term peace. In February 2014, extreme nationalists and neo-Nazis became the main driving force behind the bloody coup d'etat in Kyiv, which resulted in an upsurge in nationalistic movements. In the next 8 years, extremism turned from a marginal phenomenon into a political mainstream which pursues anti-Russian policy. More specifically, during that time, discriminatory and I would say even genocidal policy against the Russian-speaking and canonical Orthodox population and the people of Donbass in general started. Their human rights were systematically and gravely violated, in particular the right to use their mother tongue, Russian language. Russian culture became suppressed, dissent was persecuted. Nazism and their collaborators were glorified, and there was basically a campaign against everything Russian. It all culminated in the use of violence and then open war. People of Donbass, Ukrainian citizens at that time, were labeled terrorists. The Nazification of modern Ukraine has a historical background. The current political regime in Kyiv has never hidden its ideological continuity with the organization of Ukrainian nationalists created in 1929 and its militant wing, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, formed in 1942. This OUN-UPA, that's the abbreviation for that, was responsible for multiple military crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide during World War II, including Jewish pogroms, mass murders of civilians. One of their most famous atrocities was the Volhynian massacre, which resulted in the deaths of at least 60,000 Poles. In 2016, the Polish parliament adopted a resolution declaring 11th of July a national day of remembrance of victims of massacre committed by UPA and recognizing those events as genocide. Not only were OUN-UPA troops widely used by the Nazi Germany, but also a number of paramilitary units subordinated to the Third Reich were created. The extermination battalions Nachtigall, Roland, the 201st Schutzmannschaft Battalion, the 14th SS Volunteer Infantry Division, as well as Ukrainian Auxiliary Police. At the same time, a number of Ukrainians were recruited in the German SS division Leibstandard, Reich, Totenkopf, and Viking, as well as in the 1st SS Motorized Brigade. After the disappearance of the USSR and the formation of independent Ukraine, radical Ukrainian nationalism received a second wind. Neo-Nazi organizations quickly emerged and multiplied in the country. In the early 90s, OUN was legalized in Ukraine under the new title, Congress of Ukrainian Nationalists. However, the leaders were the same. Congress' first chairman was, or rather chairwoman, was Slava Stetsko, former head of OUN's Women and Youth Section and wife of Yaroslav Stetsko, the former deputy of OUN's leader Stepan Bandera. In his turn, Yuri Shushkevich, son of another OUN leader, Roman Shukhevich, established and led another Ukrainian major neo-Nazi party, the Ukrainian National Assembly, Ukrainian People's Self-Defense. In modern Ukraine, the day of UPA's foundation, 14th of October 1942, is celebrated as a state holiday, the Day of the Defender of Ukraine. OUN-UPA leaders, Stepan Bandera and Roman Shukhevich, both were awarded the title of the Hero of Ukraine after the so-called 2004 Orange Revolution. Here are the decrees proclaiming them heroes of Ukraine. Over the years of independence of Ukraine, about 15 neo-Nazi parties and groups have emerged. After the bloody coup d'etat of 2014, the representatives of the neo-Nazi Svoboda, Freedom Party, took key governmental positions. In particular, Alexander Sich became deputy prime minister. The University of Tel Aviv concluded back in 1999 report that Svoboda Party is, I quote, an extremist, right-wing, nationalist organization which emphasizes its identification with the ideology of German National Socialism, end of quote. These are the members of the Ukrainian government from that party. Today, the representatives of Ukraine in the UN assure us of their unequivocal condemnation of Nazism, blaming Russia for the dissemination of misinformation. In her statement delivered during the special solemn meeting of the General Assembly on the occasion of the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, Chargé d'Affaires of Ukraine mentioned that over 6 million Ukrainians fought in the ranks of the Red Army, while hundreds of thousands more joined resistance movements and the armed forces of the allies of the anti-Hitler coalition. The only thing she forgot to mention is that those whom now they call resistant movements were the same OUN-UPA organization members who fought for Hitler, not against him. In 2015 law of Ukraine on the legal status and commemoration of the fighters for the independence of Ukraine in the 20th century was adopted. It designates OUN-UPA fighters as persons who played, I quote, the main role in the restoration of Ukrainian statehood. In 2019, the OUN-UPA militants were assigned the status of the war veterans entitled to respective social protection measures. Ukraine's newly appointed permanent representative, Mr. Melnik, sparked controversy during his tenure as ambassador in Germany in July 2022, when he attempted to portray Stepan Bandera as in a favorable light, referring to him as a freedom fighter and denying his involvement in the mass killings of Jews and Poles. This attempt to clean Bandera's historical record provoked rare and strongly worded condemnation from both Poland and Israel, ultimately leading to Melnik's transfer from Berlin just days later. Rather than to go into specifics of historical retrospectives myself, I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Eduard Popov, a prominent Russian historian and an expert on the subject. He will offer an in-depth examination of Ukrainian nationalism. Eduard Anatolyevich, слово вам.
Добрый день.
Hello. Ukrainian nationalism arose in the early 20th century as part of the project of the Austro-Hungarian Empire of the German Habsburg dynasty to create Ukraine. The goal was to create Ukraine and the Ukrainian people as a people separate from Russia and hostile to Russia. And This included Galicia, as well as inhabitants of those places that considered themselves to be Russian. The methods of social engineering and brutal repression of Austro-Hungarian authorities transformed part of the Russian intelligentsia of Galicia into Ukrainians, and they became hostile to Russia. The current conflict began in the beginning of World War I, when Austro-Hungary and Russia were on different sides of the war. Starting in September of 1914, the first death camp in Europe was established, Tallerhof, followed by a number of other death camps. The prisoners of these camps included Russian inhabitants of Galicia. In addition to these death camps, physical annihilation was applied to the Russians, hangings, shootings. And Ukrainian nationalists emerged in the political scene, playing an active role in this genocide of Russian Galicians. And this was the beginning, the political beginnings of Ukrainian nationalism. The genocide of Russians in the Austro-Hungarian Empire was the first genocide in the history of modern Europe. Ukrainian nationalism emerged from that genocide and participated in it. Then, in 1929, in Vienna, based on the Legion of Ukrainian Sich sharpshooters, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, or OUN, was formed. The OUN called itself a part of European fascism. It was inspired by fascist Italy. And before the rise to power of Adolf Hitler, it cooperated with the Third Reich. The OUN ideology is based on the principle of so-called total nationalism, which recognizes the nation as the highest value. The leading ideologue of OUN, Dmitry Dontsov, in his book called Nationalism, lays out the principles of this total nationalism, which divides races into people into master and slave races. Of course, Ukrainians are part of the master race. Another leading ideologue of OUN, Nikolai Siborsky, in his book called Naziocracy, borrowed from German Nazism, saying that nationalism is higher than other societies and of individuals, and followed the principle of nation above all, which is borrowed from the Nazi greeting Deutschland über alles. There are many other examples, but I think this is enough to demonstrate that Ukrainian nationalism can indeed be called Nazism, and it follows in the footsteps of its big brother, that is German Nazism. The OUN platform of 1929 laid out its intention to include, as part of the future Ukrainian state, all Ukrainian ethnographic territories. These political realities will be achieved through war with Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Hungary, and the USSR. They needed foreign assistance for this, of course, so they were hoping to receive aid from Germany, the Germany of Hitler. So it's no surprise that in 1933, they began and deepened their cooperation, or rather their dependence on the Third Reich. And OUN was taken under the wing of Hitler's Nazi party. Then OUN was divided into two factions, OUN-M, that is supporters of Andrei Melnik, and OUN-B, supporters of Stepan Bandera, controlled by the German military intelligence forces, as well as the Gestapo. The Banderites were controlled by Abwehr II, the German military intelligence unit. And the OUN-M was controlled by the Gestapo, that is the secret police of the SS. After the occupation of the Third Reich, of Poland, there were two battalions formed in Poland, Nastichal and Roland. And the deputy commander of Nachtigal was Roman Shuchevich, a future commander of the UPA. This was the military wing of the Banderite faction of OUN. Both battalions, as well as many fighters of OUN, took active part in the attacks of Hitler's Germany on the USSR as saboteurs and terrorists. And they helped Hitler's occupying forces control the territories of Ukraine and other territories of the Soviet Union. And there was the Ukrainian political police, supported by SS battalions. They fought Soviet partisans and carried out punitive actions in the USSR, especially in occupied Belarus. In Belarus, during the years of the war, people were burned alive. Most of these terrorist acts were committed by Ukrainian nationalists who were correctly called Nazis. A few words about terminology. I think that with regard to Ukrainian nationalism, we could call them lesser Nazis. That's a number of movements in Eastern Europe and the Balkans in the 30s and 40s. These were collaborationalist movements that supported the Hitler occupying regime. And I'll talk more about that later. After the beginning of Hitler's operations against the Soviet Union, the OUN used its connections with the German occupying forces. And after the occupation of Lvov by German forces, which was June 30th, 1941, the Banderite groups declared the act of restoration of Ukraine. I'll read a quote from this. We've restored the Ukrainian state, which will closely cooperate with the National Socialists of the Great Germany, led by Adolf Hitler, which will create a new order in Europe and the world and will help the Ukrainian people to free itself from Muscovite occupation. So, Ukrainian people, they said, were to be freed from Muscovite oppression. This is June 1941. The OUN and its military units began pogroms at that point of Jews and Poles in Lvov. The Jews and Poles were the vast majority of the population at that time. During July, by the end of July, they killed up to 7,000 Jews, as well as tens of thousands of Poles and many of the Polish intelligentsia and elite. There were women who were stripped naked and chased in the streets, and they were beaten to death. But over the years of Nazi occupation, thanks to the Ukrainian nationalists, up to 99% of the Jewish population of Lvov were annihilated. And this began in July 1941. By the end of the war, less than 1% remained. What about the Polish population? Poles, Jews, and Russians were the main enemies of OUN, as was proclaimed in its platform. That was its ideology. And so Poles were one of the main victims of Ukrainian terror, Ukrainian nationalism. But there also was terror against the Poles that reached its apogee in the Volhynia massacre. The highest estimated figures of victims of this massacre was 180,000 people. And the methods of killing were also extraordinarily brutal. And the Poles that survived, called the Ukrainians butchers. These children, women and children were killed. They were dismembered. Children were killed before their very parents, their heads bashed against walls, and so on and so forth. You can see photographs of these events on the internet. As a result, these Poles, Jews were almost annihilated and were only saved by the arrival of the Red Army, which freed Western Ukraine from OUN terror. What about Ukrainians themselves? OUN terror was not limited to these wrong peoples. When OUN emerged, it was not yet a pan-national party. It was a purely Galician regional party. And they did not try to take into account the interests and cultural specificities of other regions of Ukraine, which spoke other languages. There were different faiths that had different cultures and mentalities. No, for them, Ukraine was purely Galicia. These are the right Ukrainians. And Roman Shukhevich said these words: "It's not a bad thing if 40 million Ukrainians was reduced to 20 million. That's not a bad thing." Every year, on July 11th, Poland commemorates a day for the victims of these massacres. They recognize the Volhynia massacre as an act of genocide against the Polish people. And I believe that we must support that initiative of Poland and recognize the Volhynia massacre as a genocide against the Polish people and condemn the OUN as a terrorist organization guilty of the genocide of Poles, Jews, Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Спасибо, Эдуард Анатольевич.
Thank you, Edward Popov.
Two Ukrainian nationalist formations, mainly the Ukrainian insurgent army, of which we have talked a lot already today, and auxiliary police battalions were involved in numerous atrocities across Belarus, to which Professor Vilkov just referred to. These groups participated in brutal operations against civilians, particularly targeting Jewish communities, partisans, and suspected Soviet sympathizers. Villages were burned, populations massacred, and entire communities erased as part of punitive actions carried out in coordination with or under the command of Nazi forces. These war crimes remain a painful chapter in the collective memory of Belarus and are a stark reminder of the devastating impact of extremist ideologies. And now I give the floor to Natalia Selukina, the Executive Director of the Historical Memory Foundation, who will give the historic perspective of rising of the Ukrainian nationalism, including in the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic during the Great Patriotic War. Natalia Vladimirovna, вам слово.
You have the floor, Natalia.
Obviously, we have some technical issue here, which I hope will be resolved shortly. Perhaps.
Hello, Natalia. Your microphone is unmuted. Please open your microphone.
Меня слышно?
Can you hear me?
Все. Окей. Добрый день, уважаемые коллеги, еще раз.
Good morning, colleagues. In December 2024, the plenary session of the 79th General Assembly, a resolution was adopted on combating glorification of Nazism. 40 countries were co-sponsors of the resolution, including Belarus. However, those that voted against, as is tradition, included the US, Canada, Ukraine, UK, Germany, Poland, Finland, Baltic states, and others. Once again, this demonstrated internationally the position of these countries and the relevance of the current problem of glorification of Nazism. The statement of Yaroslav Gunka in the Canadian Parliament in 2023 caused an international scandal after it turned out that during World War II he served in the Galician SS division. And this person received honors in Ukraine. According to the Russian Investigative Committee, he had been involved in the killing of at least 500 citizens of the Soviet Union. Russia had sent legal requests to Canada, Belarus, and Poland, who announced that they would extradite him, but this did not happen. There's an international problem that is still taking up public attention. This is the historical memory of the Russian Federation and Republic of Belarus. You can see the list of Nazi collaborators, which were studied by a number of academics and investigative bodies. The General Prosecutor of Russian Federation, Igor Krasnov, stated that measures are being taken to identify the circumstances and scale of the crimes of these Nazis against civilians and prisoners of war. There's massive criminal proceedings on genocide underway for more than 5 years now. In early 2025, the Russian Federation launched more than 30 legal proceedings with regard to war crimes and crimes against humanity, and once again identified crimes carried out by the German fascist occupiers and territories under German occupation during World War II. There's also investigation of the current genocide of the Belarusian people, and Belarus adopted legislative change allowing for the death sentence to be applied against Nazi collaborators. And in 2024, enforcers from Ukrainian police battalions were convicted under this. On March 22nd, 1943, these enforcers shot and burned alive 149 inhabitants of Khatyn, including 75 children. A few years before, in May 2015, the Russian Investigative Committee, with regard to the Nazi collaborator Vykatryuk, launched criminal proceedings. Russia, as the successor of the USSR, took on the responsibility of criminally prosecuting these Nazi criminals and demanded the extradition of Vykatryuk from Canada, but Canada refused to extradite him. So it seems there was a politicized approach toward Canada's upholding of its international obligations. There was another war criminal who, between 1943 and 1944, carried out at least 26 crimes and killed at least 433 people, including children. And thus, these killings of innocent Soviet civilians, it's important to prevent this in the future and to combat the glorification of Nazi collaborators and neo-Nazism. This is a major task for professional societies in Russia, Belarus, and other countries. There's a biased tendency to criticize work to establish historic facts, and this is becoming very common in the countries of the Baltic states, Finland, Poland, and Ukraine. Before the World War II, OUN developed cooperation with the German intelligence services and Nazi Germany, and they also took part in mass killings of Jews. These battalions include war criminal Smotsky, who took refuge in the U.S. after the war. There were a number of other former battalion members that took part in mass killings in Minsk. The nationalist documents reveal these mass killings, which were called pacification. In November 2024, Canada refused to publish the names of more than 900 Nazi collaborators and for many years refused to extradite war criminals. Canada continues systematically at the state level to support neo-Nazism and to facilitate the glorification of Ukrainian enforcers and nationalists. This is proven by the fact that on the Ukrainian Youth Center in Edmonton, there's a bust of Roman Shukhevich on that in public, who was a part of the 201st Battalion in 1942 in Belarus. He took part in punitive operations. This battalion killed more than 2,000 Soviet partisans. Authoritative foreign investigators have affirmed that these actions were genocide carried out under the directives of Himmler and Hitler. We should remind you that Metropolite Sheptytsky of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, after the occupation of Kiev, congratulated Hitler, saying, "I will pray to God to bless this victory, which would lead to long-lasting peace for Your Excellency, the German Army, and the German nation," he wrote. In 2004, Stepan Bandera was further glorified in Ukraine. The number of Nazi war criminals fled to the U.S. and became U.S. citizens, and they thus escaped accountability for their crimes against children and others during this war. According to archived documents of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia, they had asked the parliaments of a number of countries to hand over Nazi criminals that committed crimes during World War II in the Ukrainian Soviet Republic that were then living in Western countries. These are Ukrainian nationalists, in particular Dmitry Kupyak, who took part in the killing of 200 Soviet citizens but who had fled to Canada and was not handed over to the USSR. Distinguished colleagues, historians, archivists of Russia and Belarus continue to investigate the crimes of Ukrainian nationalists carried out during the years of the Second World War. Law enforcement from both countries continue to investigate the scope of these crimes against Soviet citizens, especially women, children, defenseless elderly persons, prisoners of war. After the beginning of the SMO in Ukraine, the problem of glorification of Nazism was exacerbated. Russian historians will continue to work to restore historic memory of World War II, using the Soviet and Russian legal practices with regard to Nazi criminals and their collaborators in order to erect a barrier against Nazism and neo-Nazism. Thank you. Thank you, Natalia.
After the war, those war criminals didn't just disappear. As Ms. Selukina rightly mentioned in her statement, out of fear of persecution, they fled to other countries, notably Canada and the United States. And I would like to show you a video address by an American independent journalist and historian, Ms. Lori Spencer, who couldn't join us today in person. She will share an eye-opening presentation based on declassified government documents and academic archives, shedding light on a deeply buried chapter of Cold War history. She will speak about the CIA's decades-long covert collaboration with Ukrainian nationalists, including individuals tied to Nazi war crimes.
Mr. President, distinguished ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, I'm grateful for the opportunity to address the Security Council and for the warm welcome. Thank you for the invitation. I'm honored to speak to you today about a subject I have spent over 20 years researching as a historian, one I often write and speak about as a journalist, and that is the many thousands of documents my country kept secret from Americans and the entire world for over half a century, which show a long history of collaboration between U.S. intelligence agencies, specifically the CIA, and Ukrainian nationalists after World War II, many of whom were Nazi war criminals who escaped prosecution at Nuremberg. As my time today is limited, I will focus this presentation largely on the story of one man, Mykola Lebed, the highest-ranking Ukrainian Nazi war criminal ever brought to the United States as an employee of the CIA. My research is sourced from the personal papers of Mykola Lebed at Harvard University, as well as documents declassified under the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act, passed by Congress in 1998. And as these long-withheld documents prove, the U.S. government had quite a bit to disclose. For further research, I recommend the book Hitler's Shadow, Nazi War Criminals, U.S. Intelligence, and the Cold War, published by the National Archives, available at archives.gov. You can also see many of the documents that I referenced during this briefing in my podcast series, Hidden History Revealed. America's relationship with the Ukrainian nationalists began just as World War II was ending in 1945, accelerated after the CIA's founding in 1947, and continued through the end of the Cold War in 1991. The CIA recruited, armed, trained, and funded Ukrainian nationalists as anti-Soviet sabotage forces with the ultimate goal of regime change in the Soviet Union. To give just a few examples, Operation Aerodynamic was a CIA program started in the 1950s to support anti-Soviet Ukrainian nationalists, including Nazi collaborators. Even earlier was the Belladonna Project, which originally began under military intelligence in 1946, prior to the founding of the CIA. An official CIA document declassified in 2007 reads, quote, "The purpose of Project Aerodynamic is to provide for the exploitation and expansion of the anti-Soviet Ukrainian resistance movement for Cold War and Hot War purposes. Such groups as the Ukrainian Supreme Council of Liberation, the UHVR, its military adjunct, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, the UPA, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the OUN, will be utilized as part of this program," unquote. Project Aerodynamic was primarily a propaganda program designed to promote anti-Soviet sentiment in Ukraine. The program had two goals: to encourage new and existing anti-Soviet, anti-communist Ukrainian nationalist sentiments, and to collect intelligence about, quote, Soviet Ukraine and the USSR as a whole to meet the United States needs. From 1948 until 1955, the CIA and the Ukrainian nationalists conducted extensive joint foreign intelligence operations using the cryptonyms A.E. Acre and A.E. Cartel. In these political and psychological warfare operations, anti-Soviet propaganda leaflets and other materials were smuggled into Ukraine or dropped by balloons. The CIA infiltrated their agents into Ukraine, often by parachute, but most were killed or captured by Soviet forces. A CIA approval request, dated April 30th, 1953, listed the following reasons for creating a new radio station in Ukraine. Quote, "There are no clandestine psychological warfare assets presently available through which we can reach the audience in these strategic areas. The people in these areas will be receptive targets for black broadcasts. Anti-Soviet nationalism is a potent force in these regions of Ukraine and can be exploited, as it was precisely in these areas that an anti-Soviet resistance force arose during World War II, a reference to the Ukrainian nationalists who collaborated with Nazi Germany and served in Waffen-SS divisions." The document continues saying that, quote, "The population here in Ukraine has suffered since the end of the war from the KGB MVD campaign to eradicate the remnants of these forces. Mass deportations have occurred in these areas since the war's end and have added to the hatred of the Soviet regime." The scripts and tapes of these black radio broadcasts were recorded in New York City and were prepared by Ukrainian Nazi war criminal Mykola Lebed and the CIA covert operation that he ran called Prolong Publishing, a CIA front. The tapes of these radio broadcasts were then flown to Athens for reproduction and broadcast in Ukraine. A December 1954 policy paper mentions for the first time the name of this proposed underground radio station, Nova Ukraina, meaning New Ukraine. CIA Director Alan Dulles personally brought Mykola Lebed, a high-ranking Ukrainian Nazi war criminal and convicted murderer, to the United States in 1949 and quietly gave him a job working for the CIA. Despite efforts by a few intrepid journalists to expose Lebed and Department of Justice Nazi hunters to prosecute him, the U.S. government protected Lebed until his death in 1998. So who was Mykola Lebed? Depends on who you ask. By various accounts, he was an assassin, a freedom fighter, a terrorist, a hero, a villain, a prisoner, a refugee, a Nazi collaborator, a spy, and a ruthless war criminal. To the Central Intelligence Agency, which bankrolled his activities for close to half a century, he was known as Uncle Louie. In 1934, Mykola Lebed was sentenced to death for the murder of a Polish official. The sentence was commuted in 1936 to lifetime imprisonment, but Lebed managed to escape prison during the German invasion of Poland in 1939. In 1940, the OUN, that's the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, split into two factions, the OUN-B for loyalists of Stefan Bandera and the OUN-M for followers of Andrei Melnik. Lebed was a leader of the Bandera group and was Bandera's second in command. During Operation Barbarossa, the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in World War II, Mykola Lebed did leaflet propaganda campaigns encouraging the extermination of Jews in Ukraine. Quoting from his own words, written during that 1941 military campaign, quote, "I fully appreciate the undeniably harmful and hostile role of the Jews who are helping Moscow to enslave Ukraine. I therefore support the destruction of the Jews and the expedience of bringing German methods of exterminating Jewry to Ukraine. We will adopt any methods that lead to their destruction." And indeed, the pogroms in East Galicia in the war's early days killed perhaps 12,000 Jews. The Nazis sent Stefan Bandera to Sachsenhausen concentration camp in 1942 after he declared Ukraine an independent state. Lebed then became the de facto leader of the Bandera faction, which largely controlled the Ukrainian insurgent army, the UPA, through the end of the war. Over the following few years, the UPA was responsible for tens of thousands of murders and some of the most horrific war crimes of the Holocaust. After the end of World War II, Western intelligence agencies sought to acquire OUN members as informants and infiltrators. The OUN was avowedly anti-communist, and it already had a network of trained guerrilla fighters at the ready for an anticipated Soviet offensive. The United Kingdom's MI6, their analog to the CIA, opted to work with Bandera, who later died under mysterious circumstances, allegedly murdered by the KGB. He was found dead on the steps of his Munich residence on October 15, 1959, as one declassified CIA document noted, a victim of foul play, just one day after his visa to enter the United States was approved. CIA instead chose to work with Bandera's lieutenant, Mykola Lebed, then Foreign Minister of the Ukrainian Supreme Liberation Council, the UHVR. Lebed still had considerable influence among Ukrainian nationalists, and the CIA employed him in their Project Aerodynamic propaganda program for the next 20 years. Later, documents show that the CIA also shielded Mykola Lebed from allegations of his Nazi war crimes and deportation proceedings because he was too valuable of an asset, and any publicity could compromise the entire project. Department of Justice prosecutor John Loftus was the Nazi hunter who found Mykola Lebed living in New York and was trying to deport him in the 1980s and 90s, but was stonewalled at every turn by the CIA. In 1992, the New York Times published an expose of Mykola Lebed and his past as a Nazi war criminal. In a now declassified CIA internal memo, we see how the agency would respond to that New York Times article. No comment. In that same memo, the agency added, quote, questions regarding information to which Mr. John Loftus had privileged access to while employed by the Department of Justice are a subject on which we also have no comment. These documents that Mr. Loftus discovered in a secret underground storage vault about U.S. government involvement with Nazi war criminals were kept under wraps for another 2 decades until the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act of 1998 finally made them public. In another memo, declassified under the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act in 2004, parts of it are still redacted today, we learned that the United States Attorney General personally approved the immigration of Mykola Lebed, again, the highest-ranking Nazi war criminal ever to enter the United States. Lebed was the head of the Ukrainian version of the Gestapo and one of the top 20 war criminals also wanted by the Soviet Union. Declassified documents reveal that the Justice Department knew all about Mykola Lebed and had no interest in prosecuting him. Instead of banning Nazi immigration into the United States after World War II, the Department of Justice said that the law legalized the immigration of former Nazis as long as they did not try to establish a Fourth Reich in America. Worse, that twisted interpretation was deployed to obstruct the DOJ's Nazi hunters. 3 decades later, the Special Assistant Attorney General of the United States closed all of the treason cases in occupied Germany. Not a single corporate officer ever went to jail for doing business with the Nazis, either in America or the United Kingdom. The Justice Department covered it all up. More than 100 American traitors returned home after many profitable years of serving Hitler. The Army's original investigative files, codenamed Ashcan and Dustbin, are still off limits to protect the privacy of the American citizens involved. Former CIA Director Alan Dulles used his position to protect himself and his clients from investigation for laundering Nazi funds back to America. After President Franklin Roosevelt died in 1945, all efforts to prosecute Nazi war criminals and war profiteers practically ceased in the United States. In 1985, the Justice Department pawned Mykola Lebed, a Ukrainian mass murderer and Nazi collaborator, off to Congress as an innocent leader of the anti-Nazi resistance. Almost everything the Justice Department ever told Congress about Nazis in America has been a conscious and deliberate lie. The former DOJ man, John Loftus, wrote in his book, America's Nazi Secret, quote, "The hunt for Nazi war criminals has been a mere public relations effort to placate the Jews and the World War II veterans. And sadly, as these now declassified papers show us, he turned out to be right." Project Aerodynamic was officially terminated by the CIA in the last century, but still continues in some form or fashion to the present day in Ukraine under classified new cryptonyms and projects. The CIA coordinated their Cold War efforts in Ukraine with British MI6. Today, it's a coalition of NATO spies, contractors, and mercenaries on the ground in order to keep U.S. troops officially out of the war. Thank you again for inviting me to brief you today. I'm Lori Spencer.
This video brings to light a complex and troubling issue of involving and recruiting Ukrainian nationalist figures, including Nazi collaborators by the CIA. These insights also help us better understand that moral compromises were made during the Cold War in the name of strategic advantage. At the turn of the 20th century, nationalist narratives combined with Russophobia led not only to the revival of Nazi ideas, but also to their deep penetration into the Ukrainian society. Today, nationalism permeates almost the entire political system, education and media. The Ukrainian authorities erect monuments and memorial plaques to honor the memory of Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and Ukrainian insurgent army fighters. These streets are named after them. Look at the slides. On January 1st, the birthday of Stepan Bandera, a notorious Nazi collaborator implicated in the mass murders of Jews, Poles, and pro-Soviet Ukrainians, is marked at the state level in Ukraine, often accompanied by torchlight marches that are hailed by nationalist supporters but widely condemned by critics for glorifying a figure associated with wartime atrocities. Look at the slides with the marches. Does it remind anything to you?
Бандера! Україна мати, ми за Україну будем воювати. Батько наш Бандера, Україна мати, ми за Україну.
The coup d'etat and the subsequent events effectively legitimized the attitude towards residents of Donbass and Russians as second-class people. Official statements by political figures basically confirmed this. Former Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk referred to Donbass locals as subhumans, similar to the Nazi term Untermenschen. Those who did not accept the coup d'etat were labeled as separatists and terrorists by the new authorities, who launched the so-called anti-terrorist operation against them with the use of the Ukrainian armed forces, which was, at that time, and still is, against their own constitution. The Russian-speaking southeastern part of Ukraine was shelled with heavy weaponry, and combat aviation was used against peaceful cities. The horrific crimes from the period are still shocking, one of the most brutal being the burning alive of at least 48 people on May 2nd, 2014, in the trade union house in Odessa. None of the perpetrators was ever brought to justice, and some of the massacres coordinators even ended up as members of the Ukrainian parliament. According to the eyewitnesses, many of those who attacked and burned the building wore swastikas and other fascist insignia and were armed with bats and shields. The people trapped inside the building, among them women and children, had simply run there for protection. Photos and video footage posted on social media showed people hanging out of windows and sitting on window sills as if preparing to jump, and some of them actually did jump to escape the flames. Those who survived were surrounded, severely beaten and shot. Videos also confirmed that Ukrainian riot police did nothing to stop the violence, presumably because the perpetrators were unarmed, as was reported. Shortly after the coup, Ukraine saw the formation of dozens of the so-called volunteer battalions with Nazi ideology. The most odious groups are the Dnipro Regiment, Aidar, Tornado, Kraken, and Azov battalions. The latter were the Azov battalion was in the US sanctions list. They openly wear neo-Nazi insignia and have tattoos with portraits of military leaders of the Third Reich and the Eagle of the Reich, where the swastika is replaced by the Ukrainian trident. Look at the slides. They have a long record of crimes, from looting civilian property to torture, rape, and murder. Even a 2016 UN report by the High Commissioner for Human Rights was compelled to flag this. Amnesty International wrote in its report in 2014 that armed volunteers from the Aidar battalion, I quote, have been involved in widespread abuses, including abductions, unlawful detention, ill treatment, theft, extortion, and possible executions. End of quote. Our next briefer is a historian, human rights activist, coordinator of the Crimes Against the Person Information Group, Maxim Vilkov, who will tell you about the current situation of Ukrainian nationalism, including the Azov battalion. Maxim Alexandrovich, вам слово.
Так, меня слышно?
Да.
Can you hear me?
Символом успешности
A symbol of the success of neo-Nazi ideology in Ukraine and how it has penetrated authorities and society is the story of the paramilitary formation Azov, which has now become a pan-national neo-Nazi political party, the National Corps, and a military unit within the Ukrainian National Guard and its armed forces. The inability of the ruling elite of Ukraine to offer a serious platform for the development of an independent state could be seen in political populism. And there are a number of political and public associations emerged that were built on anti-communism and nationalism. Many of these organizations have come a long way, and after the violent coup in February 2014, they were able to integrate themselves into state governance bodies. The rise of Azov was not only due to participation of neo-Nazi fighters in the war in eastern Ukraine, but also their active political engagement, their popularity among certain voters, the brutal suppression of the opposition, and their ability to enter municipal councils and the Verkhovna Rada. Unfortunately, after the Maidan, Ukraine lacked any immunity to Nazism. Cooperation with far-right groups became normalized. Neo-Nazism as a phenomenon has deep roots in post-Soviet Ukraine. In 1988, the radical underground organizations, Spadzhina or Heritage and Varta or Guard of the People's Movement, both of which embraced Ukrainian nationalist ideology and swastika symbolism, created the Social National Party of Ukraine. This party, the SNPU, chose the wolf zangel or wolf hook as its symbol. It's notorious as the symbol of a number of SS divisions, as well as the symbol of certain post-war neo-fascist groups in Europe. The platform of the party contains explicitly racist ideas. For example, they said, unlike Ukrainians whose psychology and traditions have been cultivated over the course of millennia, most of the so-called Russians are past Finno-Ugric tribes, peoples from Urals and Siberia. They are Mongoloid nomads with no history. They are emphasizing the closeness of Ukraine to Europe. The party also established people's safety squads carrying out street terror. They also established a body called the Patriot of Ukraine to support the armed forces and navy of Ukraine. You're seeing lifting of these neo-Nazis to the very highest levels. The Patriot of Ukraine launched a campaign of street terror. In 2001, the spring of 2001, they actively supported mass campaigns to support the future pro-European President Viktor Yushchenko, who tried to stay in power through street campaigns. And that was successful. On February 14th, 2004, the Social Nationalist Party of Ukraine was renamed the All-Ukrainian Svoboda or Freedom Union, and the Patriot of Ukraine was disbanded. However, it did not fade into the past. Another neo-Nazi group was the Social National Assembly, created based on the Kharkiv branch of Patriot of Ukraine, as well as SNPU cells in Kharkiv and similar neo-Nazi organizations. This new organization was established by Andrei Biletsky and openly stated that Ukrainian racial social nationalism was their ideology. Under their plans, Ukraine ought to restrict and control all foreign ethno-racial groups and deport them to their historical homelands. They said, "We, the Ukrainian nationalists," said Bieletsky, "view the so-called human races as separate biological species. And Homo sapiens in the biological sense can only be the white European man." Bieletsky surrounded himself with people who had acquired skills in sabotage and partisan warfare. They were adapted to rugged terrain as well as fighting in cities. In 2012, Bieletsky was finally imprisoned on charges of preparing an armed uprising. However, after the victory of Euromaidan in February 2014, he was released, and very quickly he established his own volunteer combat unit, and this group eventually became the backbone of the Azov Battalion. The official date of the founding of the Azov Special Forces Battalion within the National Guard of Ukraine was May 5th, 2014, but the armed group that Bieletsky had formed emerged even before that. Future Azov members had already taken part actively in the Euromaidan. They were the fighting force of the Maidan. After its success, they formed a so-called Black Corps, which then evolved into the Azov Battalion. And that is the name, the Black Corps. That was the name of the official newspaper of the SS. And this Black Corps took part in the suppression of anti-Maidan protests in Kharkov, Berdyansk, and Mariupol. And during the suppression of inhabitants of Kharkov, according to Berkut Special Forces members, the authorities were afraid that the May 2nd tragedy in Odessa would happen again. Ukraine's new government recognized the potential of these neo-Nazis. These neo-Nazis who had been attacking people with bats and rods soon turned into a shooting force. On April 26, 2014, a video appeared of so-called black men, as they called themselves. This video was released. 3 men in balaclavas and black uniforms announced that their mission was to liberate the entire southeast of Ukraine from saboteurs and so-called green men, as well as separatists. Then Azov took part in fighting in Mariupol and Donetsk, and it began to grow in number. The main part of Azov's activities was patrolling streets in the east of Ukraine and fighting with those that were against the new government. Hundreds of people were beaten, killed. Thousands were intimidated. Azov, however, maintained its ideological core, which was neo-Nazi. In a number of Bieletsky's speeches, you can find direct citations of leaders of the Third Reich, especially the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler. He said, "This is a war of two civilizations, Eurasia against Ukraine, which is defending Europe," said Bieletsky in April 2015. "This is a war that began more than 1,000 years ago. The name of our enemy has changed. They used to be Khazars, Polovtsians, Moscovia, now the Russian Federation. Remember that you are the descendants of hundreds of generations of heroes who defended our European civilization from Eurasia, from savage Eurasia." The neo-Nazis engaged in violence, but they also sought to have legal access to power. A number of their members ran for office, including Oleg Odnorozhenko, Igor Mosychuk, Igor Krivoruchko, Oleg Petrenko, Olyashko. Bieletsky himself ran as a candidate in the 2014 elections. And at that time, Bieletsky had already established plans to establish a separate ultra-right-wing organization. Based on the old organization, a new organization emerged, the Civil Corps of Azov. In 2015, there were structures built throughout Ukraine. And they were focused on working with young people, not only, for example, football hooligans or fans or the ultra-right subculture, but also with school children. They would go to schools with lectures, hold lessons, train these young people in camps out in nature for training. And they built free sports infrastructure for Ukrainians. Of course, it was only free for members of the Azov youth movement. And so young people began to go there in droves. Judging by the photos published on the internet, which you can easily find, there were many young school-aged children at these events. There is a constant ideological indoctrination of young people at these events. This new generation of Ukrainian citizens who were inculcated with neo-Nazism and racism. Azov openly borrowed the lexicon, symbols, and rituals of the Third Reich. For example, the roll call of the dead, describing it, thousands of volunteers on a soccer field. This is where the Torchlight March began. There was the 1,000-strong parade of fighters walking through the village of Urzuf. They were holding banners with insignia of the regiment and the state flag of Ukraine. The parade ended in front of the regiment base, where there was a memorial raised to the fallen Azov fighters. 33 Azov fighters were standing there to symbolize the 33 fallen brothers. Each of them had a shield on which, in runic script, the call signs of the fallen were written. After the speeches, the culmination of the ritual took place. The call signs of the fallen were read out, and then the corresponding fighter holding his shield would step forward. Andrei Beletsky said this was a so-called roll call of the dead with sacred significance. And lastly, in October 2016, the creation of the All-Ukrainian Party National Corps was announced. Since then, the Azov neo-Nazis have been fully legitimized in their activities. Today, in Ukraine, we continue to see that all of these neo-Nazi bodies united around Azov continue to be active. Since February 2022, there's been a state cult established around Azov to spread the ideas of racism and neo-Nazism to school children and young people in Ukraine. There's an entire network directly linked with Azov that is known as Kraken, and has been militarized. And there also is the civil C-14 movement. That is a network of football hooligans. You can see as well the consequences of indoctrination with neo-Nazist ideology in the statements of Ukrainian leaders, as well as media and culture, language and education. And today, members of neo-Nazi organizations are well represented in Ukraine's ruling bodies, and their ideas are being implemented. Thank you.
Спасибо, Maxim Alexandrovich.
Thank you, Maxim Alexandrovich.
One of the most frightening examples of neo-Nazi cruelty is the so-called biblioteka, or library, black site in Mariupol airport. It was run by the Azov battalion and supervised by the Security Service of Ukraine. People detained for pro-Russian attitudes were called books. After being checked, the prisoners were kept in the refrigerators of the airport restaurant. According to the testimonies of former detainees, Ukrainian nationalists used various torture techniques, including waterboarding, asphyxiation, breaking fingers, and so on, all eerily similar to those used by the CIA at their black sites, so-called black sites, the hidden prisons. However, official penitentiary system of Ukraine is also far from being an example of humane treatment of prisoners, especially when it comes to anti-fascist activists. I would like to remind you, colleagues, that about Ukrainian human rights defender Yelena Berezhnaya, whose participation in an Arria Formula meeting on the situation with national minorities and the glorification of Nazism in the Baltic and Black Sea regions in December of 2021 cost her freedom. The Kiev authorities prosecuted her for high treason after her statement and put her in custody in March 2022, where she serves a 14-year prison term. In March of this year, the European Court of Human Rights recognized Ms. Berezhnaya's arrest as illegal and in violation of the European Convention on Human Rights. In spite of this, Kyiv has not taken any action towards her release. Being of senior age of 70 plus, Ms. Berezhnaya suffers not only from persecution, but also from a number of age-related illnesses that are being seriously aggravated by mistreatment and in the absence of due medical care. Recently, she suffered a stroke and now is in prison hospital. Neither relatives nor human rights activists are allowed to visit her. Medical staff assesses her health condition as serious. Colleagues, we hope that after this meeting, your conscience will not allow you to stay silent about this brave woman's condition, and your principled stance in favor of unhindered civil society engagement in the work of the UN will force you to undertake meaningful efforts to ensure her release. Miserable fate awaits Russian prisoners of war who are tortured and abused in captivity, while desperately trying to present itself to the international community as the main peacemaker and human rights champion. Ukraine does not even bother to ensure that the norms of the international humanitarian law are respected by its combatants. Neo-Nazis are not shy, but rather proud to publicly post videos showing prisoners being castrated and kneecapped, to say nothing of being shot. We drew your attention to the situation in January this year during the Arria Formula meeting on Ukrainian prisoners of war and civilian detainees. Arranged by the United Kingdom as part of its efforts to disseminate anti-Russian propaganda, it featured a statement of a neo-Nazi Valery Gorishny, whose ideological preferences are proved by a tattoo in the form of the emblem of the SS division Death Head, Totenkopf. Look at the tattoo. To a certain extent, we feel for our British colleagues being well aware of the fact that finding a representative of the Ukrainian military who would not glorify Nazism is almost mission impossible. In particular, the symbols of Totenkopf are so popular and common in this country that even the Ukrainian president, I would say former Ukrainian president, the expired Ukrainian president Vladimir Zelensky, once published a Victory Day post on his official Telegram channel featuring a photo of a soldier wearing the insignia of the SS Totenkopf division. The image was quietly removed after public outcry, but archived versions and reports from official Ukrainian channels confirmed its initial inclusion. This episode reinforced concerns about the normalization and glorification of neo-Nazi symbols within Ukrainian official narratives. You see it on the screen. Colleagues, I trust our meeting helped clarify why addressing the root causes of the conflict is essential. As we reflect on the fundamental issues behind the ongoing crisis, we cannot ignore the troubling ideological shift that has taken place in Ukraine since 2014, which was gradually accumulating since its independence. In the years following the coup d'etat, we have witnessed a state-sponsored campaign that has not only marginalized Russian-speaking citizens, but has also sought to rehabilitate and glorify individuals and groups historically associated with Nazism. The silence and at times quiet endorsement from Western nations has only emboldened this distortion of historical truth. To understand the ongoing conflict, we must be willing to confront these developments honestly and directly. At the same time, we must remember that opportunities for peace have been on the table. In 2022, there was a real chance to reach an agreement, but tragically, some Western countries chose to undermine those efforts, prioritizing geopolitical objectives over human lives and seeking to prolong the war in vain hopes of inflicting strategic defeat on Russia. The cost of that choice has been immense for Ukraine. Now, however, we stand at crossroads. There is hope that the world can shift its course away from the escalation and towards the resolution of the conflict. If we are serious about peace, we must focus not just on ending hostilities, but on addressing also the ideological and historical wounds that underpin this conflict. By facing these challenges with honesty and courage, we can pave the way for meaningful dialogue, mutual respect, and a future where lasting peace is not just a goal, but a shared reality. I would like to draw your attention to the fact that all materials presented today are available via the QR code that you now see on the screen or on your table. Now I open the floor to those members of the Council who wish to speak in the order in which they appear on the list of speakers. I would request you to limit your remarks by 3 minutes. And first I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Chair. I thank the briefers for their statements. At the outset, I wish to reaffirm our steadfast conviction that continued tensions and escalation will inevitably result in more tragic loss of innocent civilian lives, widespread human suffering and displacement, as well as the destruction of essential civilian infrastructure. Civilians are enduring challenges, living in fear for their safety, the well-being of their families, including women and children, and the security of their homes and livelihoods. We regrettably continue to observe persistent patterns of confrontation and hostilities, despite the encouraging diplomatic efforts undertaken recently. It is deeply concerning that peace and security in Ukraine and beyond remains under constant threats, and that both parties have yet to seize the opportunity for de-escalation. Against this backdrop, I wish to underscore the following key points. First, it is the imperative to prioritize the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure cannot be overstated. An immediate cessation of hostility is essential. In this regard, we reiterate our call for strict adherence to obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law. Second, efforts must be redoubled to de-escalate tensions. The prevailing cycle of confrontation and polarization cannot continue to dictate interactions between the parties. Constructive engagement is crucial to achieving the political resolution we collectively seek. Third, diplomatic initiatives must remain at the forefront of all efforts to end the conflict and secure lasting peace and stability. In this regard, we renew our call to both parties to prioritize constructive dialogue, favor diplomacy, and focus efforts on the need to find a mutually acceptable solution, especially through the current direct negotiations. Only through open and sustained peaceful engagement that mutual security concerns could be addressed, paving the way for a just, comprehensive, and durable political settlement in accordance with the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter. I thank you.
I thank Algeria for its statement, and I now give the floor to Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We thank the briefers for their remarks and have taken note of the views outlined by them. Mr. Chair, Pakistan remains deeply concerned by the devastating security and humanitarian consequences of the Ukraine conflict. We view this conflict not merely as regional crisis, but also one having global repercussions, especially for the countries of the global south. The protracted conflict in Ukraine is also a reflection of the failure of diplomacy. Historical grievances, growing trust deficit, as well as the breakdown of regional and multilateral arrangements led to the outbreak of this tragic conflict 3 years ago. Mr. Chair, conflicts do not arise in a vacuum. We firmly believe that lasting peace requires, first and foremost, the imperative of addressing the root causes of a conflict through an earnest and sustained commitment to dialogue and diplomacy. The tragedy emanating from the conflict in Ukraine, and indeed from other conflicts that continue to rage and have had a devastating humanitarian toll, remind us once again the need for prioritizing conflict prevention, giving primacy to dialogue and diplomacy, and ensure that grievances are resolved before they escalate. Mr. Chair, the UN Security Council, the body entrusted with maintenance of international peace and security, has the primary responsibility to uphold global stability by identifying situations which could potentially lead to conflicts and act decisively to prevent them by enforcing norms, the Charter principles, and implementation of the relevant UN resolutions in order to reduce tensions and de-escalate crises. To conclude, Mr. Chair, a world where conflicts fester is both unstable and untenable. The conflict in Ukraine underscores the need to give more and not less chance to diplomacy and dialogue. This has been Pakistan's clear and consistent position since the start. We continue to call upon both sides to act with restraint, pursue meaningful negotiations, and address mutual security concerns to pave a way for a just, sustainable, and lasting peace in accordance with the UN Charter and its principles. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank Pakistan. Now I give the floor to Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. We thank the briefers for their statements, which to us underscore a fundamental truth. War must be avoided at all costs. The Russian Federation's aggression against its neighbor should never have occurred, and it must end immediately. Allow me to highlight a few key points on behalf of my delegation. First, Slovenia takes all allegations of Nazism with utmost seriousness. We unequivocally reject Nazism in any shape or form and consistently condemn it. Second, we firmly oppose nationalist ideologies that manifest in annexation, territorial expansion, and occupation. We recognize that all these actions committed by the Russian Federation, in the case that was brought before us today, constitute clear violations of international law. Third, Slovenia remains a staunch advocate of the rule of law, both at the national and international levels. We believe that when a state bases its actions on such serious accusations against another state, the legitimacy and legal grounding of these claims must be judicially determined. Independent courts should adjudicate these matters, ensuring justice is served fairly and impartially. Mr. Chairperson, we strongly reject the notion that there can be a legitimate justification for invading a neighboring country. Russian invasion of Ukraine needs to be understood in legally defined terms as an act of aggression, an act that violates international law. Such actions undermine the international law-based order and erode trust in multilateral institutions. The Russian Federation must withdraw from Ukraine, and it is through international courts, not unilateral action, that accountability for violations of international law must be pursued. I thank you, Mr. Chairperson.
I thank Slovenia, and I give the floor to Greece.
Thank you, Ambassador. We take note of the statements by the briefers. I would like to make the few points on behalf of my delegation. First, while threats to peace and security all over the world are intensifying and crises are rampant, Russia has decided once more to use the time of the Security Council to present its distorted vision of reality. In terms of the appropriate forum, perhaps the accusations we heard here today should be best processed by other institutions and mechanisms of the international community, but certainly not the Security Council. Second, we deplore attempts to shift the focus of the discussion from the much-needed respite from hostilities in Ukraine, above all for the sake of civilians and the most vulnerable among them, to a campaign that aims to justify acts of aggression by placing them under a historically charged ideological context and to blur the lines between the aggressor and the victim of this war. Despite this attempt, the fact of the matter remains that almost 40 months ago, it was Russia that brought back war into Europe by launching a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, causing so far 45,700 civilian casualties, among them 13,279 dead, including 700 children, and 32,449 injured, including 2,068 children. In doing so, Russia has violated the fundamental principles of international law, in particular humanitarian law, the UN Charter, and relevant UN General Assembly United Nations resolutions. Thirdly, and lastly, more than 3 months after the US-led initiative, results of the peace talks remain extremely limited and the path to peace remains long due to the Russian Federation intransigence. We would urge Russia to make the decisive step and agree to a full and unconditional ceasefire as a first step to a permanent ceasefire and a just and lasting peace settlement. Attempting to rewrite history with a distorted vision of reality does not contribute to any of the above aims. I thank you.
I thank Greece and I give the floor to Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I thank the Russian delegation for convening this meeting. I also thank the briefers for their insights and reflections. Mr. Chairman, Sierra Leone acknowledges the value of a full and factual understanding of the root causes and factors driving this conflict, especially at this critical time when negotiations on a ceasefire agreement are gaining traction. A comprehensive ceasefire agreement at this time will form the basis for an enduring peace agreement that benefits the people of Russia and Ukraine. This is not the time, therefore, for amassing troops and weapons. Almost 4 years of continuous fighting have clearly shown that, despite both sides having access to significant arsenals of military capabilities, this conflict will not be won by military means, but rather through a political solution that considers the legitimate security concerns of both parties and fully respects Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. We all welcome ongoing diplomatic efforts, including the peace negotiations in Istanbul and the agreement on exchange of all wounded and sick prisoners of war, as well as all those aged under 25. The fact that there's an estimated over 1,000 POWs from each side fall within these categories underscores the devastating impact of this drawn-out conflict on the young and vibrant people of these two countries. This year, as we celebrate the 80th anniversary of our groundbreaking agreement to choose peace over war and uphold the dignity of all men, Sierra Leone agrees that these aspirations for a peaceful and prosperous world require us to interrogate our differences and the causes of divergent views. In gaining a full understanding of the complex post-Cold War political environment, which has been also characterized by significant challenges and missteps in the architecture for globalization and international cooperation, we must ultimately find common ground in resolving its deficiencies while mutually benefiting from the norms, rules, and institutions of our modern world system. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, Sierra Leone emphasizes the importance of the parties respecting and abiding by international humanitarian law and human rights law. Noting the alarming toll of the conflict on civilians, we urge for meaningful dialogue and diplomatic efforts towards an immediate ceasefire and towards lasting peace as envisaged in Article 33 of the United Nations Charter. I thank you.
I thank Sierra Leone and give the floor to Guyana.
Thank you, Chair. Guyana appreciates this opportunity for a discussion on the root causes of conflicts and thanks the Russian delegation for the detailed concept note provided. We also thank the briefers for sharing their insights. Mr. Chair, Guyana fully agrees with the premise that understanding the root causes of a conflict is essential for establishing a solid and enduring peace. The root causes of a conflict can be multifaceted, with a combination of complex and intricately linked factors encompassing historical grievances, exploitation of natural resources or competition over them, security concerns, economic inequality, social injustice, racial or identity-based tensions, inter alia. Time is needed to identify and address grievances and develop a comprehensive strategy focused on long-term peace building and ultimately ending the conflict. Taking the current context as an example, this systemic change cannot be achieved in an environment of active hostilities. In the immediate term, and central to achieving a permanent ceasefire, is the need to agree on the immediate cessation of hostilities, unimpeded humanitarian access to the temporarily occupied territories, and the provision of necessary security guarantees. Addressing the root causes of this or any other conflict and promoting reconciliation requires a comprehensive long-term strategy. Guyana believes diplomacy and the instruments of international law are crucial for creating the mechanisms and tools needed to address these underlying causes. This approach requires an environment that supports open and respectful dialogue and should aim to reach a comprehensive peace settlement, one that is rooted in the fundamental principles of international law, including the United Nations Charter. To succeed in these efforts, the relevant parties must engage constructively and in good faith. They must also exercise restraint and avoid destructive rhetoric, which only belies the human cost of war, but also undermines any effort to achieve a peaceful resolution. For the bells of peace to ring, the drums of war must be silenced. In the context of the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine, where civilians, especially women and children, have paid a considerably high price, we underscore the need, as outlined in the Council's presidential statement of 18 June 2018, to prioritize the protection of children and civilians as a whole. This must be included in any strategy that seeks to resolve the conflict and build and sustain peace. In closing, Chair, Guyana calls on the leaders of Russia and Ukraine to take bold and decisive steps to create a pathway for ending the conflict. I thank you.
I thank Guyana and I give the floor to Somalia.
Mr. Chair, I thank the Permanent Mission of the Russian Federation for convening this Arria Formula meeting on understanding and resolving the ideological roots of the Ukraine crisis. We also thank the previous for their previous. Understanding the fundamental causes of any conflict is essential in establishing a solid and enduring peace. Given the efforts to address the conflict in Ukraine, is crucial to examine the underlying factors that perpetuate tensions and hinder reconciliation. The current developments serve as a reminder of the ongoing volatility in the region and the far-reaching consequences for civilian populations and infrastructure. Recent incidents underscore the urgent need for renewed efforts to reduce tensions and prevent further destruction. The protection of civilians' lives and infrastructure must remain a central concern. My delegation emphasizes the importance of upholding international law and humanitarian principles in all circumstances. We believe that lasting peace in Ukraine will only be possible through genuine diplomatic commitment, open channels of communication, and respect for established principles under international law. We reiterate our call for an immediate and comprehensive ceasefire by all parties and urge restraint to prevent any further deterioration of the situation. There is no military solution to the conflict in Ukraine. Constructive engagement remains essential, and only through sustained diplomatic efforts and a willingness to compromise can a durable and just peace be achieved. Every opportunity for peace must be seized and built upon. The Security Council's continued support will be vital in facilitating progress and encouraging all parties to remain engaged in meaningful dialogue. My delegation reaffirms its commitment to supporting initiatives that uphold international law and advance diplomatic solutions. We stand ready to support all efforts that move us closer to this shared goal. Mr. Chair, in conclusion, we reiterate our call for de-escalation, renewed diplomatic engagement, and the pursuit of negotiated lasting peace in Ukraine. We stand ready to work with Council members to support all genuine efforts toward diplomatic aim at achieving a just and lasting peace in the conflict in Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank Somalia, and I give the floor to United.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Colleagues, time and time again, the Russian Federation repeats these baseless accusations. However, the singular truth is that Ukraine is demonstrably not a Nazi state. This is a myth developed by Russia over decades to justify its illegal invasion of Ukraine and its attempts to erase Ukrainian culture, history, and identity. One wonders whether they think that if they repeat it enough, it will somehow become true. There is a simple road to peace, and it begins with a full, immediate, and unconditional ceasefire. Ukraine is demonstrating its desire for peace at every turn, through constructive engagement with US-led peace efforts, agreement to a full and unconditional ceasefire, sending a senior delegation to Istanbul for talks, and through President Zelensky's readiness to meet President Putin face to face. And yet, President Putin continuously comes up with excuses and unfeasible preconditions for why Russia cannot agree to peace. This meeting is just another attempt to keep up Russia's baseless pretense that there is some justification for its actions in Ukraine. Russia could end this war right now, and if it were up to Ukraine, it would never have started. I thank you.
I thank United Kingdom, and I give the floor to the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would also like to express my gratitude to today's briefers. The Security Council met twice just last week to discuss the situation in Ukraine. During both of those meetings, the Republic of Korea stressed the urgent need for a full and immediate ceasefire to prevent further civilian suffering. We also reiterated our deep concern over the ongoing military cooperation between Russia and the DPRK, which continues to prolong the war unnecessarily and constitutes a clear violation of multiple Security Council resolutions. Earlier this week, a second round of talks between Russia and Ukraine was held in Istanbul, but we note with concern that no agreement on ceasefire has yet been reached. Today, I reaffirm the Republic of Korea's support for all constructive efforts aimed at realizing an immediate ceasefire, the end of the war, and the establishment of lasting peace. I thank you.
I thank the Republic of Korea, and I give the floor to the United States.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Millions of people have suffered in the unnecessary Russia-Ukraine war. It needs to end. We welcome the prisoner exchanges agreed to in Istanbul, but call on Russia and Ukraine to continue negotiations to end the war. The only path to resolving this war is diplomacy. This Arria, with its disingenuous rhetoric, is not part of that path. I thank you.
I thank United States, and I give the floor to Denmark.
Mr. Chair, it is frankly hard to know how to respond to this Orwellian, history-distorting revisionism that we have all just been subjected to by the briefers. A smokescreen to try and distract and deflect and defend the indefensible, namely the illegal invasion of a sovereign neighboring country by a permanent member of the Security Council. This was a repeat of the tired Russian playbook of false claims, claims that the aggressor is somehow the victim, that a democratically elected government must be overthrown to protect human rights, and that the party defending its sovereign territory is somehow a warmonger. Russia isn't fooling anyone. No one is being taken in by this rhetoric. In every General Assembly vote, the international community has made clear that they understand who the aggressor is and who the victim is. And they have consistently supported Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Denmark will continue to defend these principles to secure a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine consistent with the UN Charter. It would be in everyone's interest if the Russian Federation now made the same effort as they have done today to engage with the ceasefire talks rather than a charade in New York City. As a first step, we call on President Putin to finally accept the unconditional 30-day ceasefire that Ukraine has been offering since March. In conclusion, the root cause of this war is clear for all of us to see: Russia's illegal full-scale invasion. Russia could end the war today if it simply stopped attacking Ukraine, end its massive airstrike campaign on civilians, withdraw its troops from Ukraine's sovereign territory, and ensure accountability for the crimes committed by Russia's armed forces. Thank you.
I thank Denmark, and I give the floor to Panama.
Thank you, Chair. Panama thanks you for convening this meeting, and we listened carefully to the briefings made. Given the evident intensification of the conflict in Ukraine, Panama reiterates its concern at the devastating humanitarian consequences. Understanding the fundamental causes of any conflict is essential in order to address the conflict and establish a stable and lasting peace. In the same way, it's indispensable that we respect established and accepted rules accepted by the entire international community that have made it possible for us to have the greatest period of stability in our history. As a matter of conscience, Panama rejects all aggression regardless of the justification provided. Our country does not accept as a norm of international law any unilateral imposition or the use of military force to force states to submit. The territorial sovereignty and integrity of states should never be subject to discussion regardless of any other consideration. This organization is a forum where we are able to talk about threats to international peace and security and search for peaceful settlement of disputes, always within the framework of international law. We recognize and encourage the direct talks between Russia and Ukraine, which we hope can continue, as well as any arrangements that can be reached through these talks and that cannot be achieved through military strategies. We believe that dialogue and diplomacy continue to be the path towards just and lasting peace in Ukraine. Panama reiterates its call for an immediate ceasefire in Ukraine in respect of international humanitarian law and for the protection of civilians. Thank you very much.
I thank Panama, and I give the floor to China.
Chair, I thank Russia for convening today's meeting. I thank the briefers for their statements. The Ukraine crisis remains protracted. Recently, Russia and Ukraine had a second round of direct negotiations in Istanbul, reached agreements on issues such as the exchange of remains of soldiers who have been killed and seriously wounded soldiers, and planned for the next round of negotiations to be held at the end of this month. This represents another small step towards peace. China welcomes these positive developments and supports all efforts for peace. In the meantime, both parties to this conflict have launched large-scale drone and missile attacks, with no signs that the fighting will stop. We note with concern recent reports of Ukrainian drone attacks on multiple Russian airports and Ukraine's explosive attack on the Crimean Bridge. We call on parties to the conflict to keep calm and restraint, strictly abide by international humanitarian law, and avoid attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure. We call on the international community and humanitarian agencies to step up efforts for relief and assistance. Chair, the root causes of the Ukraine crisis are complex and intertwined. Hence, there is a need to adopt a comprehensive approach, and there is still a long way to go to restore peace. We need to make more rational voices for peace talks heard and continuously create conditions and build momentum for ending the conflict and promoting peace talks. China's position on the Ukraine crisis is consistent and clear. We've been committed to bringing about a ceasefire and promoting talks for peace. China advocates and upholds the vision of common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security and maintains that the legitimate security concerns of all countries should be taken seriously. We expect the early conclusion of a fair and durable peace deal that is binding and accepted by all the parties concerned. We'll continue to uphold an objective and just position, engage with all relevant parties, support the international community to forge more consensus for peace, and play a constructive role to promote a political settlement to this crisis. I thank you, Chair.
Thank China, and I give the floor to France.
Ambassador, dear colleagues, Russia, with this new meeting in the Arria format, is once again organizing an exercise of pure propaganda. It is trying to turn our attention away from the atrocities that is committing against Ukrainian civilians. This misinformation will not allow Russia to change the facts and the reality of its war of aggression against Ukraine. A lie repeated ad nauseum is still a lie at the end of the day. The facts are clear, and no pseudo-historic ramblings can hide the evidence. In 2014, by invading Ukraine and then by launching its large-scale war in 2022, Russia has launched a war of aggression against Ukraine, against its internationally recognized borders. It has violated and continues to do this in flagrant violation of the United Nations Charter. Russia denies the identity of the Ukrainian nation, and it refuses its right to exist and to determine its own foreign policy. With each passing day, Russia is multiplying its violations of international humanitarian law by deliberately targeting civilian assets. Russia is trying to give us major history lessons. That's what they've tried to do this morning. But in reality, what does history tell us? Well, it tells us that Ukraine became independent in 1991, including Crimea and the regions of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. It tells us that Russia in Budapest on the 5th of December 1994 undertook to guarantee the territorial integrity of Ukraine in exchange for its ratification, Ukraine's ratification of the NPT. History tells us that Russia has been shamelessly violating these commitments since 2014. So once again, bombarding us with misinformation will not allow Russia to change the facts and the reality of the war of aggression being led by Russia against Ukraine. Last Monday, the 2nd of June, Russia transmitted to Ukraine a memorandum which was supposed to define the fundamental parameters for resolving the conflict. In that document, it demands the legal international recognition of the territories that it has undertaken to annex and the confirmation of the status of Ukraine as a non-nuclear state. History tells us that these demands are in perfect contradiction with the commitments previously undertaken by Russia. In reality, Russia is refusing to put an end to the fighting, but Ukraine is prepared to do this. Russia is making any discussion of peace contingent on recognition of its attempts to annex Ukrainian territory. The General Assembly of the United Nations has condemned these acts with a crushing majority, and several times, I might add, over the last 3 years. Russia would like to make us believe that it is fighting in Ukraine against Nazism. This is a shameless lie, and it's also a dangerous lie, because it's an incitement to hatred and it justifies the worst atrocities. Russia this morning has been deploying its revisionist reading of history in order to justify its imperialism. It is beneath all dignity that it instrumentalized the memory of the fight against Nazism during the Second World War, and that point was made by some other colleagues as well. But we will not allow them to blur the picture. And I think it's important to recall that in this war there is an aggressor, which is Russia, and there is a party subject to aggression, which is Ukraine. And so we, for our part, refuse to give in to these Russian provocations, and we will continue with our partners to act as a force for peace. Thank you.
I think, France, we have non-council member states who inscribed on the list, and I have Nicaragua.
Señor Presidente.
Chair, we'd like to take this opportunity to congratulate the Russian Federation for having convened this meeting on a very important subject. We would like to thank the briefers for their information, which helps us to familiarize ourselves with the ideological roots, past history and recent history that is the key to lasting peace. Chair, in 2014, the coup in Ukraine was led by Nazis, as everyone fully well knows, and unfortunately, there are forces that continue to believe, act and defend Nazism in public in an unbridled manner. Let us recall the victory of the Soviet Union against Nazism during the Second World War. More than 30 million Soviets gave their lives for this, and we recognize their heroic fight, the fight of the Russian Federation against neo-Nazism and its current manifestations. Chair, Nicaragua believes that we should take into account the legitimate interests of security of all countries with the aim of ensuring peace and stability in the long term in the region and beyond. In this regard, it is essential that we put an end to this cold, hot war mentality which is favored by NATO, with this expansion eastwards, cutting off and picking a fight with Russia. This must cease. We are of the view that the legitimate demands, security demands of Russia must be taken into account in a serious and adequate manner. Chair, Nicaragua firmly supports negotiations between the parties that will help to calm tensions and which will intensify diplomatic efforts. Because we believe in peace and we believe in prevention, and that conflicts should be solved through peaceful means. We reject unilateral measures such as political and economic sanctions. These violate international law and they do nothing to de-escalate tensions. We support a political and inclusive solution in good faith in order to ensure stability and peace. It is not with policies of double standards that we strengthen a world of peace. It is not with coups that we bringing about regime change and imposing politically and ideologically like-minded puppets that we can achieve a world of peace. It is in unity, solidarity and brotherliness between our peoples with a policies of peace and development. It's with diplomatic solutions. It is with all of this that we will achieve international peace and security. Nicaragua is committed to continuing to fight for peace, peace above all, in the interests of all peoples of the world, something which we long for in this multipolar world that we see emerging. At a time of so many challenges affecting humanity, we advocate to continue to fight fascism in all its manifestations in order to bring about a world of peace and development. Thank you very much.
I thank Nicaragua and I give the floor to DPRK.
Mr. Chair, thank you for giving me the floor. I thank the briefers for informative and elaborative presentations on the ideological roots of the Ukrainian crisis. I also thank the delegation of the Russian Federation for convening this meeting in a timely manner. The Ukrainian crisis did not erupt in a vacuum. The Ukrainian radical nationalist forces that came to power through coup d'etat with the support of the United States and the Western countries chose the way of confrontation with Russia, inciting of Russophobia and glorification of Nazi collaborators, and oppressing the Russian-speaking residents. As the DPRK delegation has clarified on several occasions, the Ukrainian crisis was started by the Western countries that ignored the legitimate security interests and the right to territorial integrity of Russia and pursued NATO's reckless eastward expansion under an ambition to maintain their hegemonic world order. It is none other than the Western countries who ruptured the hard-won peace talks between Russia and Ukraine in the first place and contributed to increasing civilian casualties and prolongation of the crisis by systematically supplying various lethal weapons to the Kiev authorities, obsessed with a pipe dream to deal a strategic blow to Russia. In this regard of the unanimous demand and aspiration of the international community for an early and peaceful settlement of the Ukrainian situation, the Western countries have provided the Kiev authorities with the advanced weapon systems such as battle tanks, fighter planes, and cluster and depleted uranium bombs and so on. Furthermore, the Western countries are systematically providing Ukraine with intelligence data from reconnaissance satellites, together with precision-guided weapons, even dispatching machineries to the country. Emboldened by them, the Kiev authorities are carrying out attacks on Russia's numerous locations outside of the military operation area, using the tactical missile systems, rocket launches, artillery, and drones, killing lots of innocent civilians, including women and children. All facts give a clear answer to who is the main culprit that further escalates the Ukrainian crisis and aggravates tension. If the Western countries truly care about peace in Ukraine, they must stop disseminating false narratives, pursuing the political agenda to deal strategic setbacks to the Russian Federation, and supplying the lethal weapons to the Kiev authorities. Mr. Chair, I categorically reject the reckless accusation of ROK with regard to DPRK and Russia relationship of cooperation. The Article 51 of the UN Charter and the Declaration on Rights and Duties of States clearly stipulate that every state has the right of individual or collective self-defense. The Article 4 of the Treaty on Comprehensive Strategic Partnership between the DPRK and the Russian Federation states that in case any one of the two sides is put in a state of war by an armed invasion from an individual state or several states, the other side shall provide military and other assistance with all means in its possession without delay, in accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter and the laws of the DPRK and the Russian Federation. The DPRK troops' participation in the Kursk Liberation Operation, conducted by the order of the head of state of the DPRK, is a clear, legitimate exercise of the rights of a sovereign state in accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter and Article 4 of the DPRK and Russia Treaty. The victorious conclusion of the operations for liberating the Kursk region is a victory of justice over injustice, and at the same time, a chapter of history which demonstrated the highest strategic level of the formed militant friendship between the DPRK and Russia. DPRK will remain faithful to its obligations under the treaty and continue to strengthen and develop relations with the Russian Federation in order to defend the fundamental interests of the peoples of both countries, contribute to the regional and global peace, security, and realize international justice. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the PRK for the statement. We have come to the end of the list. Before we conclude, I would like to say a few words in the end. And frankly, we, and me in particular, had no illusions about the narrative of Western colleagues today. They continue to repeat their playbook, but the aim and the goal of the meeting was not an attempt to change your official discourse. It was meant to educate you and to give you a historical overview about the ideological roots of the conflict, and to demonstrate to you that when we talk about extremist nationalism and Nazism in Ukraine, is not just Russian propaganda, but the actual sad reality. Luckily, not all Ukrainians are Nazis. In fact, I'm happy to report to you that most of them are not. But the ideology that rules today in Ukraine is extreme nationalism and Nazism. And it is, to a large extent, complicit in fueling, in the beginning of the conflict, and in fueling it. Some of you said that we are denying Ukrainian identity and Ukrainian statehood. I would request you to provide me with the exact quotes when we said that. I do not recall such statements. Our Western colleagues claim to be consistent in history matters, unlike Russia, of course. For example, our French colleague seemed to be very emotional about it. So prove your consistency then. Do like Ukraine did. Acknowledge Philippe Pétain, Pierre Laval, and Fernand Brinon and other heroes of the Vichy regime, and make them heroes of France. And that will square you with what Ukraine is doing. Today, you had an excellent opportunity to recall some of the basic historic facts related to the Ukrainian neo-Nazism and nationalism, which is, since 2014, proclaimed the mainstream ideology of the post-Maidan coup Ukraine. We understand that acknowledging this fact implies acknowledging true colors of the current regime in Kyiv, which is exclusively portrayed in the West as a beacon of freedom and democracy against the backdrop of allegedly non-democratic and backward-looking Russia. But these are facts. They cannot be overruled or even shattered by baseless claims about Russian propaganda. Briefers who spoke to you today are not a part of the Russian propaganda army. They are serious scholars, and they come with serious research that they are making in their lives. You may choose to ignore or silence this, but it will not make them less relevant, these facts. However, it will make you complicit with the support of the regime, which directly stems from Hitler's collaborators and fully shares their Russophobic, anti-Semitic, and xenophobic values. The regime that worships those who have blood of innocent Jews, Russians, Poles, Ukrainians on their hands. Are you comfortable with this? How does it fit into your values? The proofs of the neo-Nazi backbone of the Kyiv regime is everywhere to be seen in modern Ukraine, obsessed with whitewashing and heroization of Nazi collaborators, naming streets and schools after them. The numerous cases of such troubling acts are being painstakingly documented inter alia by the Ukrainian Jewish Committee and the Holocaust Remembrance organizations in Israel. By all means, you can pretend that they are not existing, but a simple fact check will prove you wrong. We also understand that our Western colleagues will try to avoid at any price acknowledging the obvious, the neo-Nazi nature of the current regime in Kyiv. That's the most apparent takeaway from their statements today. The reason is obvious. If they embrace the truth, they will have to accept rightfulness of one of the aims of the special military operation, denazification of Ukraine. And we owe it to our children, and we owe it, that this is sacred duty, to free Ukrainians themselves from it. And we will do everything in our power to eradicate Nazism at our borders. So, before we adjourn the meeting, I would like to draw your attention to the book that those who who may choose to do so may find at the exit of this room. The book is called War Crimes of the Kiev Regime, Materials of the International Public Tribunal on the Crimes of Ukrainian Neo-Nazis 2024-2025. It's on the exit. I thank you for participating, and I would like to especially thank our briefers for their deep and sober briefings that they provided us with today. The meeting is adjourned.